The Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Well, happy Labor Day weekend. It is back to school time for a lot of families and kids and teachers. I don't know about your experience with school, but generally speaking, I liked school growing up. I liked to see my friends and learn new things and enjoyed the extracurriculars. But I imagine we all know or remember that school is not just all easy friendships and exciting science experiments and wonderfully grueling band and sports practices. From the very beginning, there's pressure to be liked, to succeed, to fit in, and to find a group of friends who hopefully aren't known throughout the entire school as being total nerds, who aren't at the very bottom rung on the popularity hierarchy. I was especially reminded of this reality after watching the movie Wonder. Now, I know I am behind the times on this one. It's a movie that was released 2 years ago, adapted from a book, and actually in part a true story, and I had heard great reviews. It took me a while, but I finally watched it last week. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's about a boy named August Pullman, Augie for short, who was born with a number of craniofacial anomalies, and after 27 surgeries, still had a very distinctive, unique face. He had been homeschooled until reaching his 5th grade year, at which point he and his parents decided it was time for him to join his peers at his local school. As you can imagine, it was not a very easy transition for him. He was teased and called names and left out. He shed a lot of tears over the course of the year, and the school cafeteria became a pretty good barometer for his social acceptance. He ate alone at the beginning of the year, and when the first kid went to sit with him, he attracted a lot of stares and was teased by his supposed friends. The second kid to brave sitting with Augie was warned against contracting the plague if she got too close. It was heartbreaking to see and heartwarming at the same time. Unfortunately, sitting with Augie was a pretty big risk for these kids. From the perspective of the social hierarchy, that is the typical school cafeteria, they were not doing themselves any favors. But that wasn't what was important to these 2 kids. Hopefully, most of us have come to understand that while it can sometimes be hard to imagine when you're in the thick of it, life isn't meant to be about fighting your way to the top. Social hierarchies don't actually get to tell us how important we are or how valuable we are. And as you can imagine, after taking the risk, these kids made great friendships. They laughed together and braved the taunts and the teasing together. The benefits far outweighed any concern they had over some flimsy social hierarchy. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's a cute story, Pastor Amy, but what's your point? Well, this story, particularly the cafeteria scenes, strikes me as a modern-day parable for God's kingdom that isn't so different from the one we hear today in our gospel reading. In God's kingdom, you don't rise to the top by ignoring others. There is no quid pro quo, and the hierarchy is not what we think it is. Most of us don't find ourselves in a school cafeteria much anymore, but we all have places and situations in which we are tempted to put ourselves ahead of others, to give in to social pressures, and let some kind of flimsy social hierarchy define us and the people we meet. There's a quote from the movie that says, "When given a choice between being right and being kind, choose kind." I think given our text today, we could say, when given a choice between elevating yourself above others and being humble, choose humility. When given a choice between getting ahead and being kind, choose kind. It's not always a popular choice or an easy one, but that's one reason why it's consistent with God's kingdom. If you ever wonder why Jesus was killed or need a reminder that Christianity is not meant to be an easy way of life, this passage is handy. A little context here, these dinners were often about building your reputation. And it was customary to walk into the room, scan the guests, and estimate your social position relative to everyone else, to judge yourself and everyone else. You would then take your seat based on where you thought you fit in. If you were particularly interested in making important friends, you would overestimate a bit, putting yourself in the company of the higher echelon. So, imagine the scene. The tables are overflowing with food. The wine is warming the hearts of the attendees. They're having a great time catching up with friends, maybe doing some networking, rubbing elbows with those who building a relationship with now might come in handy later. They're feeling pretty good about themselves and their station in life. They're paying close attention to their reputation, knowing it will pay off. Note that their focus is on themselves and on relationships as transactions. And then Jesus speaks up and publicly shames them. Talk about a Debbie Downer. I imagine that party ended pretty quickly. According to Jesus, this jockeying for power is unacceptable. It is not kingdom behavior. Now, it's kind of strange to hear part of this text as a parable, but that's what it says, right? He told them a parable. It sounds more like a basic observation about social customs. Yet Jesus often speaks in parables when he's offering a glimpse of God's kingdom. So Jesus is not just offering some Miss Manners advice on how to act at a dinner party here. He is talking about God's kingdom, a way of being in relationship with one another that is not a transaction, not based on reputations or on getting ahead, which was ludicrous to his audience. What Jesus is asking the guests and his host to do is ludicrous. But compared to the world as it is today, God's kingdom often seems unbelievable. To act the way Jesus calls us to act in these parables seems unattainable. And maybe that's the point Jesus thought the Pharisees were missing. God's kingdom is unattainable. Just look at the guest list: the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. In Jesus' time, these were folks whose experience with hospitality would have been very limited within a society where your reputation is everything, and with a market that runs on a steady exchange of goods and services, in exchange of mutual obligations, of paying people back. These folks would have been the outcasts, the uninvited. The poor didn't have the means to repay their hosts in a socially acceptable way. The crippled, the lame, the blind would have been perceived as sinners, infirmity often linked to punishment. Yet the kingdom of God is a banquet that includes just these people, because there is no exchange for God's hospitality. There is no assumption that these folks are somehow estranged from God, that they're being punished. There is no difference between the religious elite and the outcasts of society in God's kingdom. For everyone, no matter where we seat ourselves during a theoretical wedding banquet, no matter where we think we fit relative to the rest of the guests, not a single one of us can attain God's kingdom. We can climb the social and corporate ladder all day, every day. But in God's kingdom, that's not what matters. We can't schmooze our way in or buy our way in or work our way in. No matter what, we're all unable to complete the exchange between us and God. There's no hierarchy at God's table. We all fall short, and we're all invited anyway. You are invited to the banquet. On the days when you feel like you are the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, you are invited. There's no RSVP card to return. Our invitation is right there in the waters of baptism, and the mercy and grace therein never run out. You are valuable beyond just yourself in the host's eyes. In God's eyes, you're amazing. God created you. Jesus humbled himself for you. The Spirit dwells within you. You are a gift to the world. But it's not something to be prideful over. It's something to be recognized and shared and acknowledged in others. Because the reality is, this doesn't make us any different from or better than anyone else. What makes us special, God's love for us, God's gifts to us, God creating us, God forgiving us, is what makes everyone else special too. What and who makes us worthy of an invite, God, is what makes everyone else worthy of an invite and a place at the host's table. Which leads us to the mutual love that we hear about in Hebrews. The author here describes what this means, and it involves solidarity with those who are suffering, remembering them as though we ourselves were in their position, offering hospitality, which in Greek literally translates to offering love to strangers. And when we do this, we are participants in bringing God's kingdom to earth as it is in heaven. Along with the Hebrews, as we wait for the fulfillment of God's kingdom, we trust what God says to us. I will never leave you or forsake you. And so we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can anyone do to me? And we'll need those words in our mouths and on our hearts because, as we talked about earlier, making kingdom choices can be unpopular and difficult, can lead to ridicule and social criticism, but it can also lead to love and life, and that's the stuff of God's kingdom here on earth. Every time you come to this table with nothing and you glimpse God's heavenly banquet, God of all creation being placed into your empty hands, may you know God's kingdom, which is gifted to you and the world. And may this meal and its promises strengthen you to share the mercy and love of God's kingdom, right here and now, with all whom you encounter. In Jesus' name.